Hi, this is Danny Doyle, and sorry again for the sniffling and the voice. I am still stuffy after getting over the flu last week, but it's 2025. Happy New Year to anyone whose time zone is 2 weeks in the past, or if you're choosing to rewatch this video on a future New Year's, Happy New Year's to you as well. 2025 is the year that we are all but confirmed to get the sequel to the Switch. It's currently being referred to as the Switch 2, but in continuing from the previous naming scheme, it's probably going to be called the Submissive or the Dominant. My money's on Submissive, but let me know in the comments what you believe. But with the Switch's predecessor right around the corner, it's got me thinking about the next Fire Emblem game. No, I still don't think it's going to be the FE4 remake. I have an entire video devoted to that. If you want to check it out, it will be linked below. But assuming that it is an original story and not a remake of one of the old Japanese games, there's a bunch of different directions that it could go. As of late, Fire Emblem has been super experimental, so there's not really any way of accurately making predictions about what the next game would be like. But it is still interesting to think about what we would want from a Fire Emblem 18. So this video is going to be just that, my wish list of features that I would like in the next mainline Fire Emblem series. But as awesome as it would be to ditch hub worlds entirely, get rid of avatars, and have a transgender protagonist, I want to keep this wish list relatively realistic. There are certain things that just aren't going to happen with intelligent systems helming the series. You gotta turn to ROM hacks for them. So on this wishlist, I'm only going to include changes and features that I think Nintendo or Intelligent Systems would reasonably add in the next Fire Emblem game. With that in mind, my first wishlist item is a small one, but I want voice acting for the avatar's default name. I have given up on hoping for a Fire Emblem game where the protagonist is not an avatar. It's simply not going to happen with modern FE. But there is still hope for saving the voice acting from the awkwardness of saying, "Greetings, Professor," and "The Divine Dragon!" If you've ever played Fallout 4, you'll know that that game has voice acting for a number of names you could give your self-insert character. While I think having the absurd 200 plus names that Fallout 4 has would be a bit too much to ask from a SRPG, I do think it would be cool if the lines were recorded to include the avatar's default name. If you choose to keep the default name, then it would have that in the voice acting, and if you chose to change the name, then it would change it to whatever title they decided to go with. That way, at least for me, when on a first playthrough I'm trying to absorb the story, I won't have my immersion broken by the fact that everyone keeps calling me Mrs. Professor Supergod. The second thing that I would like them to add is a new weapon type. We've had a little bit of experimentation with weapons in the recent titles. Awakening and Fates added stones for the Manicheets and Beast units. Fates also added hidden weapons, which were a play on knives from Tellius, but instead had more of a focus on debuffing effects. Three Houses added fists, which are brave weapons that couldn't be used by mounted classes and have incredibly low might. And Engage brought back knives and fists, but did a little bit of a twist on them. Engage's arts use a hybridization of your strength and magic, and its knives had more 1-2 range options while also applying poison, which itself kind of feels like a play on the debuffs from the Fates games. So, since Intelligent Systems has shown a willingness to experiment with more weapon types that work differently and sometimes even use completely different mechanics, I think it would be cool for them to continue along that track. One area that comes to mind for me is medieval-style guns, kind of like blunderbusses or hand cannons. I don't want modern pistols or shotguns or anything that would seem out of place for a Fire Emblem game, but I don't think it would be unrealistic to include early examples of gunpowder weapon. You could even say that it's powered by magic, similar to the cannons that Mage Cannoneers use in the Engage DLC. Personally, I wasn't a huge fan of the way that Mage Cannoneer's artillery was worked into the game. It always being a long-ranged weapon was a little bit annoying to me, but I did think it was kind of cool for it to use dex instead of strength or magic, and the fact that they all had secondary effects added to the weapon's distinctness. So if early firearms or some other form of magical gun is added to Fire Emblem, I think that taking what worked from Mage Cannoneer as a jumping off point would be a cool place for them to start. Of course, they could go in some other direction. There are plenty of other options for weapons. I just want to see something beyond the simple sword, lance, axe, bow, and magic. And speaking of magic, I would love to see magic experimented with and made more creative. Both the offensive magic from tomes and the supportive magic from staves or white magic, depending on the game. Awakening and Three Houses experimented with additional effects added to dark magic, and Engage made all of the different schools of magic, Fire, Wind, Thunder, and Surge, feel different by giving Thunder 1-3 range but removing its ability to double, Fire being just the default, Wind is weaker but effective against flyers, and Surge is 1 range locked but infinite hit. But ultimately, I felt like these systems kind of fell flat because there weren't as many options for spells as there are for physical weapons. The effective damage from hammers or the critical boost from killer weapons is just more flashy than spells dealing extra damage to flyers but being low might anyway. Thunder was probably the coolest iteration, so I do think it would be cool if Thunder, L-Thunder, and Thoron kept their traits from Engage, but I also think adding some secondary effects like Swarm and Luna and Dark Spikes had in Three Houses would make magic feel a lot cooler and more rewarding to use. Especially since more and more enemies have a resistance stat, magic can feel like it falls flat without these extra effects. Looking to things like D&D and the various RPGs inspired by D&D systems, there's just so much depth you can go into with a caster, and doubly so if you focus on support. Fire Emblem normally has healing staves and transportation staves, but it struggles to have any additional utility from staffers. Obstruct was a really cool option in Engage, and the Again staff is incredibly powerful, but it is cool when it pops up, especially if it's very limited. Extra status effects like the freeze and debuffs that we had in Fates, and maybe even Hexing Rod if you're feeling brave. If you're afraid that these statuses could be too strong, you could just make bosses immune to some or all of them as well. Honestly, it would be cool if some of the more tame Engage abilities were converted into staffs. Imagine if there was a staff that could summon a single double-like unit. Obviously, it wouldn't be a Lin double because we're not in Engage anymore, but something that functions the same way. Or if Soren's AI redirection staff were a staff that's just normal now, instead of being a special ability he can use. And if all else fails, you could go back to the Game Boy Advance well and add Light Ruins and Mines and the Unlock staff all as staff options instead of consumable items. But speaking of the Unlock staff, I would like Thieves to return and do it as a utility unit. Now, I think it's unrealistic for them to have a modern Fire Emblem unit who can't do combat at all whatsoever, but I would like a much more limited combat. Maybe give them seal skills so there's a focus on debuffing. I feel like that's what they were trying to go for with the ninjas and the thieves in Engage because of shuriken debuffs and poison from knives, but they just gave thieves really good personal bases in Engage, and in Fate's stats are so liquid that being able to use shurikens with a much stronger unit, or just being able to use effective weapons like the Sting Shuriken and the Hunter's Knife, made it so that your ninjas were able to delete enemies anyway. I think if they focused on giving thieves weaker weapons as well as slightly lower stats than your other units, but the ability to apply these debuffs or other status effects that the enemy doesn't want, like maybe some knives give freeze instead of debuffs, and some knives will silence enemy mages but they don't do any damage or something like that. I don't know. Combine that with actually adding chests that only thieves can open, and making doors that thieves can open not just breakable by any unit whatsoever, as well as maybe bringing back a stealing system. Probably not the Judgrel and Tellius one, but maybe adding stealing like it was in the Game Boy Advance or in Fire Emblem Three Houses. That way we are incentivized to bring thieves around and have this really cool utility unit, but not have them just feel like another combat unit who isn't really different from the others. I don't know, I just think it's cool when a unit can fulfill a completely different purpose than the rest of your army. Yunaka is still just killing people, whereas Matthew is contributing despite his inability to do combat, and I think the second one is infinitely cooler. But speaking of a class that I want, let's talk about reclassing in general. I made an entire video about my views on the modern reclassing epidemic, linked below if you are interested, but I'll just give these spark notes here. I think that the reclassing systems in Three Houses, and especially in Engage, eroded a lot of unit identity, and would much prefer a return to the way things were in Awakening or Fates. For those who haven't played the 3DS games, each unit had a limited set of classes they could reclass into. In Fates, you could also gain additional classes based on your support ranks with other units, but were limited to 2 additional ones, one of an opposite and one of the same gender. Because of how free reclassing is in Engage, units felt like they were just a collection of stats and you could stick them into whatever class you want. Meanwhile, in Three Houses, the boons and banes and the unique skills do make the units feel a little bit more distinct from each other, but ultimately they do kind of blend together into a soup of snipers, grapplers, wyverns, falco knights, and grimoires. I think the perfect solution would be to introduce a mode difference similar to the classic versus casual mode. Have a restricted reclassing option and a free reclassing option. In restricted, people have a specific class set similar to in the 3DS games, but in free, you can reclass them to whatever you want, and you get to make the entire game into your fun little sandbox. In addition to reclassing, an aspect of modern Fire Emblem I'm mixed on is the turn wheel system. I think it's good to have some sort of checkpointing or rewind for long maps, that way you're not resetting if you game over an hour into it, but I think that modern Fire Emblem has been a bit excessive in how many turn wheel charges it gives, and I will always find turn wheel less interesting than the save points introduced in Shadow Dragon and retained in New Mystery. As much as I would love save points, I think it's a little bit unrealistic to ask for them back. So instead, I think turn wheel charges having a more balanced distribution would add to the push and pull tension of the next Fire Emblem game. 10 charges in Engage is pretty excessive. Even in the late game, I didn't find myself using all of them on Lunatic. Meanwhile, Three Houses hands you even more, and then makes up for it with some bullshit ambush spawns, which I don't like either. I think the best we got with turn wheel was SOV, the first outing of it, but even then, to the end of the game, you have a few too many charges in my opinion. I think 3 or 4 charges in the early game and scaling amount of charges as you go on, but no more than 8, 9, or 10 in the very late game would be ideal, and even then that's probably an excessive number of charges. I know right now supports are kind of a bugbear in Fire Emblem discourse, but honestly I don't want them eliminated, and even if I did, I feel like they are such an essential part of modern FE that intelligent systems wouldn't do it anyway. So instead, I hope that they tone down the support system a little bit. Engage actually seemed to be aiming towards this before the patch that let you build supports in Insomnia. You could only build support points on player phase, and as a result of that, a lot of supports built slower. The support conversations themselves were still incredibly long and drawn out, in part because of the voice acting, but I think that a combination of making supports build slower, as well as having more impactful rewards, perhaps like the Fates reclassing that I mentioned earlier, would make them feel like they don't interrupt the game flow as much. And speaking of which, While I would love for a Fire Emblem where there's no hub and everything's just a menu like Tellius's bases, that's again something that I don't think is super realistic. So instead, I would like the hub area to be cut down and have significantly less essential features, and the ones that exist not take as much time. I'm thinking something similar to the Fates My Castle, and it kind of sounds like my dream Fire Emblem game is just Fates, which, not entirely wrong. Both Three Houses and Engage just had a ton of time-consuming activities that felt near mandatory, like the arena for funds or leveling up your emblems, the meals to boost skills, and everything was scattered from each other and took a long time, including a bunch of cutscenes that, while technically skippable, actually took an absurd amount of time even if you skip them all. I think having things like the blacksmith or the skills you can learn be part of the preps menu in order to get around portions of the hub would be a good compromise between people like me who can't fucking stand the hubs and the more casual players who really enjoy what they bring to the table. My last two are definitely the biggest asks and probably the most unrealistic items on my wish list, but I want to mention them anyway because there is a possibility, I would say, of these happening, however slim. The first is an addition of some post-game modes such as reverse recruitment, 0% growths, minimum growths, or 100% growths. We saw that they were willing to add fixed growths as a post-game option, or as a first playthrough option for Fire Emblem Engage if you played on the highest difficulty, and I think that potentially opens the door to other fan-favorite gameplay variations and modes. It would be really cool if they had a baked-in randomizer or a baked-in reverse recruitment or something like that, just to give the game some more replayability, especially since we seem to have moved away from the route splits, which honestly I am a fan of. I wasn't a huge fan of replaying Three Houses 4 times in order to get the entire story. But perhaps my single biggest wish for the next Fire Emblem game is the setting to be something other than medieval fantasy Europe. We've gotten 17 Fire Emblem games, and 16 of them are pretty standard high fantasy. There are some interesting elements like the techno mole people in Three Houses, or the animal shapeshifters in Tellius and Awakening, but for the most part, it has just been standard fantasy stuff. One of the things that I really like about Fire Emblem Fates is Hoshido feels distinctly different from all of the other Fire Emblems. Nor is pretty similar to your standard FE, but all of the classes and aesthetic and even music in Hoshido are things that you just don't find in other Fire Emblem games. I think some cool possibilities would be like an island setting with cool piratey classes and different forms of pirates and stuff like that. Or maybe a setting based on the Middle East if they got cultural consultants and didn't make it super racist. So yeah, Intelligent Systems, I don't trust you with that one. Heck, even changing the time period to allow for something like a Gothic Fire Emblem, since you would still be using swords for a lot of combat there, or something earlier than medieval. Maybe like a Fire Emblem set in the Bronze Ages and stuff like that. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the sort of future fantasy that Final Fantasy has going on, but anything to shake up the formula I would take at this point. But that's enough of me. What about you? What are your most requested or anticipated wishlist features for Fire Emblem 18? Be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments, and while you're down there, liking the video and subscribing really helps the channel out. Speaking of helping the channel out, I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. So, thank you to Eris, Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Floho Gamer, Robin D, Lizard Bongwater, Johnny Patronal, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Thaythom, Andu, Reflect, A Clever Username of Lies, YLO1, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, Flohe, Gabe the Green, Control Aegis, Roman Kormancic, Knick Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Bell Wenska, Dicyke, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Aerith Emblem, Adele, and especially my Jakins, Justin Robinson, Joshua Ross, Christopher Bueno, Lilzabeth, Autumn Kelsey, and Julia Kyoto. Y'all are what makes this channel possible, and I cannot thank you enough. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there is a link to my Patreon below, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. Today's comment code word is Vampire Emblem, so include that if you made it to the end of the video, that way I know you made it this far. And, as always, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.